One, welcome back, everybody. This is CSUN Performance Ensemble in conversation with. My name is Fernando Martinez. I am one of your hosts.
And my name is Jefferson Denham. I'm the other host.
And yeah, so today we wanted to continue having, um, I don't even know if I would call them serious, but like, I'll just go with the word, more serious conversations,
Yeah.
specifically on activism, which I think both ties off really well with what we spoke about last week, but also just about the ensemble itself, right? And before we started recording, or a couple days before actually, we were just talking about what we wanted to talk about, right? And what topics we wanted to discuss. And the question that I had was sort of considering the word activism in the actual act of activism, both inside and outside the theater. Um, and maybe I want to do like a real quick association game with you, right? So when you think of
Okay.
so obviously this is all
Is this like a Rorschach test? Are
yeah.
you going to find out my deep seated psychosis because of my answers?
Yeah. Um I mean when I talk about activism, like what comes to mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is I love how your cat is going to punctuate everything that you say. So there's a nice little sort of like subtext of blah, blah, blah. Meow. Like yeah, way to go, Fernando. So go back to your first question. I'm easily distracted. Oh, a bird. See, I told you.
Oh,
So activism, you're saying.
yeah. So what comes to mind is just off of the word.
Okay, well, actually, not just the word, but it actually triggers a couple of thoughts in my head. And maybe my thoughts are not completely unique to everyone who's watching, because I think we've just endured a whole week. I will use the word endured of understanding and revisiting the George Floyd uh, travesty.
Hmm.
And I mean, you can see people breaking down on the witness stand. And but so out of tragedy, uh, myself, you, many people I know went to the streets and said, this no more. And it was a great trigger for activism, I guess, in that way. Um, it's funny because, you know, it was during a pandemic. And so it was, I guess, bittersweet is the way to say it because everyone was masked up. I know when I went, maybe if you experienced the same thing, everybody was masked up. Everyone was trying to be, you know, cognizant of the fact that we're in a pandemic. But it was so encouraging to see people say, with their bodies, by participating and their voices, we are going to stand against racism, against hatred, against things like this that have happened forever and left us feeling vulnerable, feeling like what else can we do? It's like every time I see a mass shooting, you just feel like the same old tired uh, uh, excuses, I'm going to say, from the other side, like, oh, no, we can't do anything about it, blah, 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 Second Amendment or whatever. I'm kind of all over the map here. But as far as activism is concerned, I just think the George Floyd thing was profound in the effect it had on our psyche. I think it was I hope that it created momentum and continues to create momentum for people of goodwill to find any and every way they can to speak out and make a gesture with their voices by expressing their outrage. I mean, you're seeing a little bit of it now too with the horrible voting squelching going on in Georgia, and corporations are actually speaking out now. And thank you, Stacey Abrams, who is, I think, a badass, amazing human. So there's a rambling long answer to just the word activism. So now I'm going to just turn it right back at you, my friend, and say activism, I guess, in the context of PE, but also in a broader context. What does that word mean for you?
Um, to me, I mean, honestly, to me, so the first thought that comes to mind is that a lot of what we do in response to what is wrong, right? So activism is just something that is like deeply rooted in what is fucked up, right? Like the only reason we have like acts of activism is because things are fucked up, right? Because people are being hurt, because people are being persecuted, because people are being um, oppressed in a system that was never designed for them in the first place, and so it's a continuous vicious cycle. And again, going with the whole it being rooted in what is fucked up, it's like then in response you have to retaliate in this method which puts the body at the center of it, right? And for some people that is dangerous. For some people who are not able-bodied, right, it's impossible to sort of center themselves physically, but you have to risk your life again. And that's what I think about, right? How like it's fucked up. And anyways, and so it comes from a bad place, and it puts you in a position that's difficult to sort of navigate. I do think a lot about the differences in what we saw. For example, these sort of cult like groups, right, with the last presidency and how they were protesting, and how a lot of people called them out because they weren't doing it in a safe way, right? And how when we do protest for things that we believe are incorrect, like you said, you see everybody being masked up. You see everybody taking as much precaution as they can. Obviously, it's harder to sort of separate from one another because there's a lot of people there in support of whatever the cause is. But to me, everything is just rooted in things that have been inherently um, and systematically designed to be messed up. And so that's what comes to mind. I think that when I think about it in context of inside the black box, inside the theater, within PE, it's more of a personal method of activism, right? I feel like you're doing more for you in hopes that it'll do something for other people, but you definitely put yourself in the center. And not to say that's a bad thing, right? But like that's what I think about. Um, and I don't know what you like. I don't know. Well, I
Well,
don't.
what I love about what you just said too is putting yourself in the center. We have to feel it. We
Mhm.
have to. I mean, study after study shows that we make the majority of our decisions on an emotional basis. You can be in some sort of debate with anyone and try, and all the facts can be on your side. But if someone else can make the audience feel something, they will carry the day. And so when we are talking about the black box, certainly we're talking about taking all of the stimuli, all of the avalanche of information and in the subject matter we're discussing, especially the avalanche of wrongdoing or systematic wrong, racism, whatnot. Um, all that statistically can mean one thing, but if I can show you what that feels like from the inside out in a way that makes you resonate with it because you're a fellow human being too, that's when it makes a difference. There's a great movie. Actually, I'm not sure the movie's all that great, but my niece's horse is in it. It's called Concrete Cowboy, I think. Have you heard about this? It's on Netflix.
No.
So it's based on kind of a real situation in Philadelphia where, and I'll just do this really briefly, but back in the day, there weren't cars, there were only horses. And then when the transition went from horses to cars, there was a remnant that remained in Philadelphia. And these horses are still there. And they're all African American people who tend to these horses, ride these horses in Philadelphia, right? And the story is interesting because it's talking about how, the concept of being a cowboy, right? The John Wayne dude or whatever, and how that is actually not an accurate reflection of history. History rarely is a reflection of accuracy. I should probably put it that way,
Yeah.
right? But anyway, so here's a whole microcosm of humanity that are basically trying to exist, and corporate America is trying to take away any sort of way for them to exist. And that kind of struggle in a microcosm, I think, can be multiplied all over the country, maybe even all over the world. The powerful are doing their best to get more blood out of a stone, right? They don't care they've already got, who told me this? I think someone put this in kind of a perspective for me, like Jeff Bezos, what is he worth? 3.5 billion or whatever, gazillion.
Worth
And
and what humans should be. Yeah.
yeah. So if you were to tax that guy, there's been banter about raising the tax rate. If you were to tax that guy $1 billion, right, and applied it to all these great services for his fellow humans, he'd still have 2 point something billion with a B. Okay, so is there a systemic problem in this country? You bet your ass. And processing that kind of thing. Here's Fernando. I was just thinking about this the other day. The guy who took all the famous photos from the Civil War. His name was James Brady. I think I'm getting that right.
Mm-hmm.
And so think about it. Time is going by, right? And now all of a sudden, photography is the thing. You're able to capture moments. And so in that little sliver of time, he was able to take these photos so that we, sitting here in the 21st century, can look into the eyes of people in the mid 19th century. There's that famous photo, you've probably seen it, of the African American with all these horrible scars on his back.
Yeah.
That is what I think happens in the black box. All this stuff is happening around us, and we're able to take a photograph, an emotional photograph, in such a way that you can look at it and experience it along with the performers and everyone else in the room.
Yeah, it's interesting too when I think about that. The name was Matthew Brady. I think is what it was.
Got it.
Yeah. I completely forgot about that name for a while. I had a book of like all his photography. A
Yeah,
lot.
yeah.
But it made me think about too like the because you obviously you brought it back to sort of the theater, right? And it made me think of all these terms that a lot of people are learning or are realizing that they have to learn, and they either accept it and learn these terms, or they get upset at it and refuse to sort of join the movement, right? And so like learning things like microaggressions or intersectionality, or learning stuff like that, right? One term that I thought about was performative activism. And I'm only bringing that up real quick because obviously performative activism is just sort of like people pretending to care about an issue and posting it online, without actually doing anything, right? What's interesting is when I think about what we do with PE, is it's performative activism, but not in the same sense, right? Like obviously, we may not necessarily be out in the streets, though we might be able to do that on our own time. But we do set these things in a very, it's just very artistic, very theatrical, very nuanced, and maybe it's just a little bit it's just difficult to understand sometimes, right? But it is a method of I think fighting back whatever system it is that you're fighting against, and I think that that's the inherent value in what we do, right? That being said, I wanted to ask you the purpose of PE, right? It's in the name. It's creative or social change. So we are activists, right? Like that's the point. Like, so we're trying to bring change. And so the question that I have for you is, how do we, as a co-curricular class in the Department of Communication Studies in CSUN, in Southern California, right? So very specific. How do we foster an environment where we can create acts of activism, or where we can develop one as an activist from the theater to the outside world? How do we facilitate that? How do we
Yeah.
foster?
I'm going to turn that question back to you in a second, but I do have an answer for you. Okay, I think I have a two-pronged answer. The first is, you must be an activist yourself. In other words, you got to be doing something outside of the black box. It's no good, because then if all you did was talk about it within the black box, it truly would be performative, right? Only, with no substance behind it. But I found, like when I've volunteered and I consistently did it with a group up in Hollywood to help the homeless, then if you talk about that issue, you have credibility. Otherwise, you're just a fan. You're not really doing anything to change the world. You're just talking about it. So there's the first thing, is finding what can you do outside of an audience watching, but doing to actually move the needle for social justice, moving towards the justice side.
Mm-hmm.
The second answer I would say is within the black box itself. I think it's kind of important to coming up next week on PBS. There's going to be a biography by Ken Burns, the guy who did the Civil War and so many documentaries on PBS, on Ernest Hemingway. Now, whether or not you like him as a person, I don't think he's the most attractive human that ever lived, but his style of writing is worth noting here in this conversation. And that writing style is the following: being suggestive enough to pull the audience forward to get meaning for themselves versus telling them point blank, this is what I want you to think and this is what I want you to do. So I think that effective performance ensemble energy is that you present something where you don't preach, but you do demonstrate emotion, feeling, but almost in an abstract way, abstract enough where it causes the audience to have to engage. They can't be passive. And so your piece has to pull them out of their seat, get their hearts out of their chair to meet you in an emotional place. So those are the two things I think are super important for performance ensemble. So now back at you, brother. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that with the theater itself, okay, first off, I want to start off by saying that what you said is true, right? And I want to explain a little bit more too, in case anybody that wants to join is watching. I know that we do have a lot of people that were a part of PE before who are watching this, and a lot of people who work at other universities. But in case anybody that wants to join is watching, yes, we do hope that you know, outside of the theater, outside of the department, are doing activist work, right? But I hope that people don't, because I agree with it, but I hope people don't feel discouraged because being an activist to me doesn't necessarily mean like you have to be putting your body on the line every single time, right? Throughout, especially last year, because there was so much we didn't know about COVID, especially at that time, I was very cautious, right? Um, because I used to spend my time in three different locations. Obviously, I had to cut it down to one specific location, and I like hunkered down like there, and I never like left, right, unless it was for something that was necessary. Um, and so when a lot of the protests were happening, a lot of the protests for George Floyd, the protests for Andres Hordado, who a lot of people have not heard of, was a security guard who was killed at his job location because they thought he was a gangbanger, but that was he was a security guard there, and he was shot 9 times, right? And I realize this is graphic, but he was shot 9 times. He was shot in his back, so he was running away, right? He had turned, and they still shot him 9 times, execution style, right? There was a lot of movements, especially here in LA, because that's where it happened. A lot of protests out here, and I wanted to join so bad because I know that online I'm very outspoken. I mean, like I have no qualms saying whatever it is that I want to say, but I couldn't go out there just because I was very cautious about my health and the health of the people that I live with. And so to the people listening and saying like, "Oh, we have to like be activists all the time, like even outside the room," like, yeah, but it's not as crazy as you think. Like, if you're not able to do something, there are other ways of doing it, right? Like by being an ally, I think you can be an activist. By supporting, if you do have the means, which I recognize has been difficult for a lot of us because a lot of us lost our jobs. There's a lot of issues just financially, but if you're able to donate just $15 to something, right, like that is a game changer. You are doing an act, like you're actually in this sense, you're putting your money where your mouth is. Like that's what you're doing. Um, and so I do want students to know that. Another thing that I wanted them to know in reference to what you said is I think that the first step in being an activist too is having something to care about, right? Like maybe you don't know how to argue it, maybe you can't debate somebody on it, maybe you can't even write it down in a sentence. That's fine, but have something to care about. Um, you have your things, I have my things. There's a lot that we overlap in the things that we care about. And then obviously there's also very specific things that you care about because that's what you grew up with. or it's something that you witnessed, and I have my own things, right? So there's that. To follow up and answer the question of how do we foster an environment for potential activists and for activism both inside and outside, I think we do that by not putting any pressure. Um, because we sort of get, and I think a lot of this too we owe to our director Jade, right? Because I think she does a wonderful job at this, where she is able to find a theme that is clearly important in the world that we are living
Mm.
right now, right? So if we're talking or no, yeah, I'll go with that because take for example America in three acts. If you remember that performance, where a lot of it was situated in um, points in time, right? It was a timeline, and that's how the performance is situated. A lot of it, even if you're doing something that's very imaginative, that deals with the future or deals with the past, and then you're sort of rewriting a lot of that stuff, it still relates to today, right? A lot of the issues that we've seen that you thought, oh yeah, that seems like such a 19th century issue, right? Are issues that we're still facing today, which is ridiculous. Um, and I think that you are given that theme, but are not given the pressure to have to create something specific. It allows you, I think, the time and space to really just pick at your brain and figure out what it is that you want to do. And it, I don't want to say the word force, but I think it really encourages you to find very creative ways of saying things um, without having to say it if you don't want to, right? Like you
I
can,
love that. I love that, Fernando. Yeah, keep going.
yeah, I mean, I was just going to finish it off with like, it can be something as simple as, um, okay, so using a personal example, before Jay took over, Pavi directed for a year, right? And I would say that that's also when I sort of started venturing out into more um, just weird sides of performance because Pavi is weird, and that's what I love about her. And so I did this performance that was a love letter. Like I was just expressing my love for something, right? And it sounded like it was a letter for someone, but it wasn't. It was literally a love letter to the earth, right? Talking about how you want to marry the wind, how you want to just like be embraced by the trees, the water, fire, like all these things, right? And it was such a weird thing. But I said all of that expressing my love to something which sounded like it was going like it was towards a person, but it wasn't. And that is a way to sort of fight for environmental justice, right? Because you're
Right,
really
yeah, right. And with that example, Fernando, what I love about that too is that you drew the audience to a play. I think another thing that art does is present things in a surprising way, or it catches you off guard because it's everything's hidden in plain sight. We've talked about this before. We, as human beings, we have blinders. We just do, and it serves us in many ways from not being overwhelmed. But that means you're missing things in plain sight. And so, what you did with that piece is that right, you sort of tugged on something that felt familiar, so people thought kind of like a cliche would be, oh, I've heard that before, I know where that is, and then you gave it a twist so
yeah.
that it had a new resonance, right? So for our audience, anyone who is interested in signing up with PE, here's another cool thing to just sort of build on Fernando's point. There is no pressure other than the challenge, I guess you could call it, to be authentically fully yourself. Imagine yourself as a child where you didn't have all the layers of possible shame and ridicule or whatever for honest emotions, right? So a lot of us journal, hide those things away. What you find, and we've talked about this here before, is when you are authentic and you're willing to be vulnerably authentic, you are talking to people, fellow humans who have the same capacity to feel shame, feel joy, feel all the things you feel. But the fact that you are expressing it in a way that's just true to you, really, that's the big, I think that's the big point. All of the things, like Fernando said, if you find something you care about, how does that authentically resonate with you? Your answer does not have to be approved by your parents or your religious leader or the director of the show. It has to be absolutely who you are, and that's both challenging and liberating at the same time, because we have all of these masks that we must wear, hats we must wear during the day as we sojourn into the world. But here's a space where you can explore something and you're in a nurturing environment and you can be absolutely honest. That's pretty profound. And I don't use that word lightly. You will find profound things. They will reveal themselves to you from within you.
Yeah, and absolutely, and also, I feel like I've said this here, and I don't know if maybe I'm confusing it with my class because I've been saying this a lot in my classes too. Where so I just got to the persuasive speaking section of my public speaking, one of my public speaking courses, right? And
Right.
to me, it's one of my. This might seem like I'm straying away from it, but I'm not. Like I'll I'll tie it back in. But to me, it's my favorite section to teach in the class because um, I think a lot of students feel that persuasive speaking is only like, oh, look at me, like I have a superpower, I can convince people of something. And that's not it at all, right? Like it's only a part of it. I think a bigger part of persuasive speaking is being able to think critically and analytically, to be able to process a lot of the information because we are inundated with information, right? We live in the world of technology and just fast served information. Um, and one of the things that I was talking to them about is you I was just telling them like in this next section, so for the next month or month and a half, we are going to be arguing for a lot of things. We're going to be arguing for in service of a lot of causes, and some people might not like it, and that's fine. That's not an issue, right? Because obviously you guys can debate that. But at the end of the day, the bare minimum is education. Like if you don't educate yourself on something, how can you do anything with it? Right, and I think that going back to performance, and I think this sort of relates to the question of how do you foster activism or acts of activism outside of the black box, is that while you're doing this, I think it's going to spark an interest in the way that you want to educate yourself, because you're already, if you're in PE, you're obviously already a student at CSUN, right? So you're already getting your education in whatever it is that you're studying. Because I think one of the cool things about it too is that you get people from all sorts of educational backgrounds, right? Like people from just whatever department. It's not always strictly communication studies. Um, but I think that what it does is that it really, really, I think spikes an interest for a lot of people in wanting to educate themselves on issues that they may not have heard about because you're learning this from your other classmates. You're listening to, maybe you somebody says something you don't agree with and you can have that discussion, you learn something out of that. Or maybe you thought to yourself, you know what, there's this one thing that I've always been curious about but I've never really spoken about, right? Like I've never really had a conversation. And I think this is a good question to ask yourself, um, as an activist or as a potential activist, is how much do I know about any given topic, right? And do I have the right to talk about it? And I'm like, you do, if you educate yourself on it. That's the bare minimum. And I think it becomes a very, like you said, a very liberating experience to know more about something that you want to fight for, right? Um,
Right. Do you feel like, Fernando, I have a question for you. Do you feel like, because my wife and I were driving today and we, under this bridge, and you see this all over LA, there are homeless folks have found shelter under the bridges because there's shade, obviously. And then so certain businesses will come along, like there's a Chick-fil-A that opened up near this bridge. And so all the homeless people were basically vacated from that spot so the Chick-fil-A would look nicer. And it's a dilemma. So if you are watching this and you're putting together a piece and you're thinking, I'm just going to rail against business and Chick-fil-A, you are all assholes for, shoving these home. I'm not saying this is exactly what happened. I'm just saying if this scenario happened, and rightly so, we should feel indignation for human beings being treated like eyesores rather than looking at the systemic problem of why are they there in the first place. But to make something different, I feel, and this is this is a long question. I'm going to get there to a question for you, Fernando. But it seems to me and I'm just toying with this idea that you have to be willing to go for a long game feeling. It can't be like, well, I'm outraged. You watch the arms of the angel, Sarah McLaughlin, here's a starving puppy. And, so you knee jerk, send $5 and then you go, oh, okay, I'm done. Versus a long term or it's a delayed gratification kind of thing. It's almost like you keep arriving. It's never done. Do you feel like that's part of a healthy way to look at any sort of activism?
Yeah, yeah, I think the phrase that it's like, um, what is it? It's like it's always going but never arriving, right? And I think that's a major part of what it is to be an activist is knowing that you are not fighting the fight for a day or a week or a month. If you are able to accomplish whatever it is that you wanted to accomplish, it's great, but the fight continues, right? Um, and unfortunately, and I think this is part of that sort of vicious cycle that's just it's just a vicious cycle, right? It's sort of hard to dismantle because a lot of it is backed up by um, policy. It's backed up by money that we don't have to be able to defund ourselves, right? And so the fight is always continuing. And I think that another way to foster, I think, yeah, I feel like you, I feel like you also answered the one of the first questions. I think that's one of the ways that you sort of foster an activist within the theater and outside the theater is sort of letting them know it's like you're doing great by fighting now, all right, but maybe after you're done with this course or you graduate for however long you stay in PE, because everybody stays for a different period of time, right, that you're still going to fight outside of it. um I think that's fair to say, and I think that's sort of an inherent part of sort of fighting for a cause, and it's unfortunate in its own ways, obviously, because if you're still doing it, it means there's still a problem, right? But I think the good that comes out of it is that you genuinely become invested in human rights or in rights for of others or of things, um, rather than just saying that you have a vendetta or you're upset for a month and trying to figure something out, right?
Right. I think, again, the through line there, and this is a lovely audience, if you've watched this for a minute, you've seen that, I'm in therapy and blah, blah, blah. And I've said this before too, that if you want to try to actually, what helps you, especially if you are going through mental health challenges, depression, like I do, if you can take on a cause or a challenge or something that benefits others, it not only is it the right thing to do, it makes you feel better too. So it's just this wonderful dynamic of creating pieces that help that are speaking to a bigger issue, just like beyond just what I want to change, for my own benefit. So I think that's where I feel like PE exposes you to this. It may start from a germ of a really cool, authentic moment for you, but then as you see, it can be replicated in many, many other people's experiences. And then you can see, wow, I can make this picture broader and make a bigger impact than just, what's impacting me personally. I think it all has to stay personal. That's how you feel it. But it does give you a perspective on other human beings because everyone has trauma. And if you can understand how that feels and communicate it in such a way that others feel it too.
Yeah, and you know, I think too, and a good example of a lot of what you just said right now too is our good friend Lynette, right? For anybody that doesn't know, it's somebody that she was part of our graduate cohort. So we all like obviously were friends. We shared an office space together. We all taught. Um, in the last couple of months, I think it's especially since what happened unfortunately last year with the George Floyd case. I think because we were all stuck at home too, everybody just became more aware of what's happening, right? And rightfully so, we became more enraged. And I think that we've become a lot more open to sort of understanding other issues outside of what's happening just here, or Yeah, and so one of the things that's been happening lately is what was happening with Armenia and Azerbaijan, right? With the issue with Artsakh, and how they were essentially committing genocide of the Armenian people. And I bring her up because it's one of those things too where you do see some people who only talked about it for a week and completely forgot about it, right? And then you have Lynette, who to this day is still fighting the good fight. She still talks about it. She's still fighting for it. She is still screaming, kicking and screaming to make sure that people still know about what's happening, right?
Yeah. And
Because
I, you know what, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a perfect example of the long game as we've been talking about. And as you articulated earlier, Fernando, you know, there is no, we're always arriving, right? Like imagine you were around in the 60s and you campaigned for the civil rights bills of 64 and 65. And you could say, woohoo, we did it. We're done, right? And then when you don't pay attention, you saw it being dismantled. And we're now in a state of dismantling all the gains that we've had. So now you can be discouraged by that. You can say, damn, I thought that issue was done. Or you can say, this is a through line in my life. And like any relationship has to be nurtured. We're always arriving. We never arrive. Now, some might think, oh my God, that's frustrating. But I'm going to say, why not have these through lines? It gives your life purpose and meaning when you are, you know, so many people are looking for something to, what did Martin Luther King say? I told you this before. If a person has nothing to die for, they've got no reason to live. And so, and these usually are, again, connected to what can I do to make the world a better place for as many people as possible. There's always going to be an issue to rail against. There is, because there are powerful people, powerful interests, but we have the ultimate tool, which is our voice and our bodies and our creative and our storytelling. Storytelling, pen is mightier than the sword kind of idea. That we can do.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, it's one of those things too where I think so. As you brought up like how some people might find that it's an exhausting process or an exhausting way of living, and it really isn't. I think it can get exhausting mentally at points. It can get exhausting emotionally because you are seeing a lot of people suffer, right? And I think that's just I mean, that's just the biggest sign that that you do feel for other people, that you feel empathy, right? And that's a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, sometimes it can hurt us, and it's okay to take breaks and it's okay to pause. But I think that ultimately the fight's always just going to continue. Um, I can never imagine London not fighting, right? And it's not just the issue with Armenia, or I mean technically the issue with Azerbaijan, like with what they're doing to Armenia and its people, but it's us also recognizing what's been happening in Hong Kong, which people seem to have forgotten about, right? That was a huge thing. What's happening right now in oh man, Myanmar, I believe, is the country, right? What's happening with the increase in violent attacks against the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities here in the U.S.
And don't forget the Uyghurs in China, the Muslim community being
Yeah,
absolutely terrorized
yeah.
and brutalized in China.
See, so that's another example, right? Because in our like performance cohort, we had somebody who was who was of Uyghur descent in China, right? And um, I had no idea that that group of Chinese people even existed until we met her and she told us about the issues that are happening. And you got to educate yourself, right? Like she only gave us as much as she could, as much as she was willing to, because she has that right. And then it was left up to us to educate ourselves, and we did. Um, so I, man, I miss her, but yeah, like that's
Me too.
I think that's the beauty of what happens here, and I think that's part of the life of an activist is that it's always learning, and I think education is a beautiful thing in that aspect, right? Not only do you become educated, but I think you become a better person. You become a better, sort of. I mean, society is a machine, so you become a better cog of the machine, right? Since we're sort of stuck in this hellhole anyways. Um, so you become a better piece for it. And I think that society as a result becomes a better place for everybody. I also think that the role that art has in it, right? So performance is a major key. And I think it's also just a real like off topic thing, but it's just like annoys me how we do not defund the things that need to be defunded, but things like the arts are, right? Especially in a place where we always argue like, yeah, we want social change, but you know what? Let's defund the creators for social change. Like that, the irony in that.
I know that's a perpetual sore topic for me too, man. I can't stand that thinking. It's
Yeah,
very short-sighted. Very short-sighted.
yeah, but I think, like we were saying, that's the way that we sort of foster an environment for people that are interested in joining on how to become activists, both inside and outside of the theater. I think another thing that also happens is that um, okay, so real quick, I know that you've heard this, but when we started grad school, one of the things that they always tell you is that the people that you go to grad school with are the people that you sort of just become lifelong friends with, right? You sort of stay in contact with them, and it has been the case with us. Like we haven't seen each other in what 2 or 3 years, technically, like as classmates, but here we are.
I know, right? Exactly. Well,
Um,
to your point too, like being an activist and certainly being a part of performance ensemble, there's a shared experience that you've had where you are trying to, and it's all based on what you said, the idea of lifelong learning. And if you're not learning, you're dying. So it's part of living and part of being a part of a community where everyone is aspiring to that. And also being willing, this is what I love too. I remember hearing this about about the scientific community. They're always willing to be shown how they could be better, how they maybe made a mistake in their thinking, how to correct it. And I feel like that's part of being an activist too. It's not just shouting at the other side. It's trying to understand the other side. Why do you believe the way you believe? I was in a band and we were on this long road trip. If I already told you this story, sorry. Uh, and so we were talking, and I said, "Now I know you're conservative, and I'm basically a moderate liberal." And I said, "We've got 4 hours in the car. Can you just tell me why you believe what you believe?" And if I'll tell you what, activism for me has taken on that kind of dimension. If I really want to have the credibility to share my side of the story, I have to listen to their side. And so I just listen without commenting, just go, okay, just want to understand where you're coming from. And invariably, the other person I'm talking to with a completely different point of view than me will say, why do you believe the way you believe? And I feel like now there's times where that you don't have that luxury.
mhm.
There's times when you just got to show up and push back. But in most of our lives, I think we have the opportunity, and this is kind of tying back to as far as like activism is concerned, tying back to the idea of creating an environment where people can feel what you're trying to say versus you preaching at them. People, when you preach at them, will become defensive, won't let any new information in. But if you can show that kind of, we're all in this together, we're all human beings, there's a lot of stuff we have in common. And if we could just tap into that pool, I think we're going to find that our activism will resonate and go further.
Yeah. I think I just want to sort of continue on with that too, and or maybe first sort of highlight the thing that we were talking about earlier about the whole lifelong education thing. I think that on par with that, you also have this thing that happens, magical thing that happens where the people that you create art with in such an intimate, um, in such a visceral and equally or I think beautiful way also become the group of people that you stay in contact with. A lot of people that I created art with in the ensemble when I first started 6 years ago, are people I still talk to this day. Are people that, I mean, obviously with COVID and everything, I haven't, but are people that I would still spend time with. Um, that I still create things with, which is insane. Um, and I think that that also allows for this continuous, I think this continuous yearning for education, right, and yearning for wanting to change and change things. Um, as far as what you were just saying right now, I think that's also another beautiful thing that you get out of it, and this sort of relates to why I brought this up to my students too. It's not just you being pissed off. I mean, you should be pissed off. Um, and if you do have the privilege of being able to talk to somebody and understand why their points, why their argument is the argument that it is, right? Um, then that's great because you get to hear the other side, but then you also get to push your idea forward. And even if they refuse to hear it, even if they refuse to give you the attention that your argument deserves, right? The conversation will be had. And I think that in and of itself is one step in the right direction for the.
And do you feel, Fernando, in that regard, do you feel like even if they don't give you the your due so that you can present your side, or if it does feel heated in the moment, do you feel like they still might walk away and think about it later?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's something that I've actually experienced again with people that I surrounded with myself with academically because um, again we think of Southern California is like majority liberal place, right? But I mean, in places like Northridge, it's not necessarily completely liberal. It really isn't. You do get people from all walks of life and whatever. That's fine. Like that's not an issue. And so some of the people that I talked to, there were issues that they disagreed with heavily with me. Um, and so we always had conversations, and they never said, you know what, I'm on your side. But it got to a point where they were saying, you know what, I think I understand why you're saying that, or I think I understand the issue a little bit more. Maybe I need to rethink.
Right.
And even if they didn't switch sides on that issue, the fact that they reconsidered, I think, is a win. Obviously, you do have issues that are much more bigger than, oh yeah, I agree with it or not, right? If it comes to the death of somebody, again, the issues with police brutality, right? That to me, obviously, I can't just be like, oh yeah, they agree with me. It's fine. It's not. Somebody lost their life, right? But if you can get somebody to sort of change or see the way that policy change would be good for everybody and not just one group of people, I think that would be the victory.
And
And
I think with performance ensemble, that's what's beautiful about it is that you can have this kind of a performative narrative, and people can walk away and think about it and process it much later,
yeah,
days, weeks, months after the fact, and be wrestling. If we can get people to just even wrestle with these concepts versus just like a cliche, I've decided what it is, but to sort of get people to wrestle with the idea, that's certainly on the road to a win. And so I know that's what Performance Ensemble is able to do.
yeah, and I mean, and that's one of the things too that we used to teach our students, right? Is like when you're writing something, if you're just using other examples you found online, people may not connect with it as much as if, in comparison to you using an example that deals with you or somebody that you know or your family because it's more personal, right? And again, it leads to a lot of the stories that we tell in the stage.
Mm,
These are all personal stories. Um, but despite them being personal, you have no idea how much they can reach out, right? A story that you tell now, or that we've told together in Caged Bird, now situates itself in China, right? With Guzelner being out there. The stories that we told
right,
exist over there now.
right.
That's how narratives work. That is how social change works. It travels, it goes everywhere. So,
And someone once told me this, maybe you've heard this too. You don't know where you are on someone's continuum. You could be the one planting a seed. You could be the one planting that, or nurturing that plant or whatever, or you could be the one at the end where they're actually making a change, or you're making a change. But you could be anywhere along that continuum, and even planting a seed is enough, is powerful.
mhm. Yeah, I think that we all serve different purposes, and I think that obviously there are different methods that we can use in order to sort of push those changes. And I think that the ensemble is a beautiful reminder of what place and what voice you do have, because you may come into this thinking that you don't have either of those when you do. And I think that that being said, I sort of wanted to close up our conversation today. I think that Kat's saying it's time. This has been CSUN Performance Ensembles in conversation with. My name is Fernando Martinez. I am one of your hosts.
And my name is Jefferson Denham. I'm the other host.
All right, awesome. All right. Oh yeah, I forgot the
All
wave.
right. Thanks for being with us, everyone.